Welcome back. We just took 2 months off the Citizens Climate Informational calls, and we are gearing up for a very busy fall. This is the September 2022 informational call. The agenda is here on the right. And while we're waiting for people to join the room, I'm just going to go over a few upcoming events. Today, in about 4 hours, en français, the first time ever, we have a French-only event open to the public. People from the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty will be sharing their presentation in French. Next Tuesday in the morning, we are inviting women in all their diversity to talk to us about climate change from their perspective. And so far, we have 2 Panamanians, a Somalian, and we've got a Kenyan and a Nigerian who are going to share with us, and we're awaiting for more. So, and basically what we're trying to do is gain perspective from our volunteers, especially women, about, what's happening and what they need. And then in Canada, we have an event on Friday, October 14th, at 11 a.m. to 12:30 with MIT in Climate Interactive and our parliamentarians. And we're going to learn together about On-Road's policy simulator, and our parliamentarians will be engaging with MIT Climate Interactive. And so far, 5 parliamentarians or their staff are showing up on the call, and we hope for 15. And lastly, circle the dates. I don't have information right now, but Citizens Climate International will be running a People's Pavilion on during the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. So today, our learning objectives are for you to learn more about Citizens Climate International's primary areas of work. We do focus on carbon pricing, so we will spend about 10 minutes on that at least, and also just begin to understand how we work. So we have core values and the 5 levers of political will. Our founder was Marshall Saunders. I wish you all could have met him. He hummed on a whole different energy level than any other human being I ever personally got to be with, an extremely generous human being with the grandest of hearts. And he got this organization off the ground, an amazing philanthropist. He realized, although trained by Al Gore and gave those 100 presentations in the first 18 months or so after being trained in 2006, he realized policy change was needed in governments. And he was willing to fund an organization that would work with governments to create evidence-based policies, not being able to find one that could do it in a way that he knew works. He got CCL off the ground. So thank you everyone for being in his dream. He passed away just after Christmas in 2019, and this is his vision. So thank you for being part of it. We at Citizens Climate International are part of Citizens Climate Lobby, and we exist to create the political will for a livable world by enabling individual breakthroughs in the exercise of personal and political power. Citizens Climate International, we just punched over 20,000 supporters outside the USA, and we are found in 189 countries on the planet. We are organized in 76 countries with 51 countries with active chapters and 151 active chapters. So we are about over a third of the size of CCI, about a third of the size, or quarter of the size of Citizens Climate International, with 2.5 staff, and CCL USA has 70 staff. So please keep that in mind. But we have amazing volunteers, and we do 4 things at Citizens Climate International. My main job is to help volunteers with their advocacy. I create programming and follow through on initiatives to help them do their work. We do spend a considerable amount of our energies on carbon pricing, but we do also support other things. But this is our main lobbying focus, understanding that this is not always suitable for all countries. And so in other countries of the world, we help with other things, and we support so many other initiatives at Citizens Climate International. Anything that's evidence-based, that lowers emissions in a socially just way, we're behind it. We also do civic diplomacy, going to the G7, the G20, the World Bank, and as well as the UNFCCC COPs. And hopefully this year, we're going to the biodiversity COP in Montreal as well. We're in the final stages of getting our accreditation. So wish us luck that we can go to the biodiversity COPs as well. And Joseph Robertson, our executive director, writes brilliant summaries of all of the work that we do, piecing together in a very thorough way. Like, he writes at a whole new level. Brilliant. Like, do take the time to read what Joe's writing, because he pulls all this together, all this complexity, and somehow you will read it very carefully. You can see what's coming. It's so beautiful because we are watching what's happening both at the volunteer end of things and also at the diplomacy end of things. So last year at the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change in COP26 in Scotland, they finalized the rules for the Paris Agreement, and a foundation was laid down for COP27 in Egypt to be an implementation COP. So expect a lot of things to change in November. And we won't know the results of that until think tanks, summarize it for us till December or January. So we anticipate a lot of big changes. The information's going to be coming at us like crazy. Okay, it's going to be fun because we're going to see change, and we've got to make sure that it's a good change. And that's why we exist, to help you and your countries make sure that this change is good. So we were at COP26, and I just want to acknowledge that this meeting happened at COP26 in Scotland, where the Canadian Prime Minister, the President of the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, and Mark Carney, who is a very distinguished finance person who used to be the Bank of England governor. Anyways, they had very high-level discussions about the type of carbon pricing policy we advocate for, which is climate income, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, trade as enforcement, there being a global floor price, and also tying special drawing rights at the multilateral banks to climate finance, so that we can start shifting money away towards a livable and equitable future. So that the dialogues are happening at the high levels, but we all live in democracies and they can't impose these things on us. We have to help them build the political will for this to happen. So thank you everyone for being here today. I left COP26 with the knowledge that yes, loss and damage and a lot of money is promised to help the global south adapt to what is coming, was not solidified, and I was very disappointed. And that was a very difficult thing to manage. But I do want to take a moment to acknowledge, and the slides are in the chat, and if somebody wants to reintroduce them for me, that would be great. Lots of like you have to imagine lots of policies and lots of agreements internationally have to be laid down for this to happen. And all of these sorts of things happening, a big one with the methane pledge. There'll be a voluntary carbon markets and integrity initiative. All of these things really started to lay down the foundation. More countries joined the Powering Past Coal Alliance. I'm going to discuss this in a moment, Mia Mottley's speech at COP26 demanding quantitative easing. And there was lots of other things. I'm not going to go into them, but you can look at them. So imagine lots of tracks were laid down. But the three most hopeful things I think we could all focus on here is here at the bottom, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero committed to $130 trillion between COP26 and 2050 to finance net zero. And this is more than enough money to transition our economy. And imagine this doesn't come from the taxpayer. This comes from private institutions. And what they need is government rules for that to happen. So they need climate disclosure rules. They need carbon pricing. They absolutely need carbon pricing. They need trade mechanisms to level the playing field so everybody can play, so these institutions will have a level playing field so that what they finance will not be overtaken by competitors who are allowed to pollute the planet. Okay. And none of this has to come from the taxpayer. They just need rules. Now, the most hopeful thing happened for me was in DREAM, and noting that I think there's over 60 countries are in this organization called Finance Ministers for Climate, including the United States of America. Okay, so this is really good. And this was the moment at COP26 when I felt the world lift off my shoulders. Progress on climate policy and the transformation of the economy will not be linear. And this was what an economist said in a session about the finance ministers for climate. So I just showed you all those tracks that were laid down. We're looking at an implementation COP in Egypt. All these policies governments are going to enact are going to start really shifting the economy. So although we see this like barely any decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, if all goes well at COP27 and thereafter, we can start to see transformation of the economy. So before I continue, are there any questions or comments? Go ahead, Gladys.
Can you say more? What is meant by implementation COP?
Yeah, that's wonderful. So for over 30 years now, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has been building a framework, because it's a framework, for governments to create policies globally that will transform our economy away from fossil fuels. So the Paris Agreement laid down those rules. So that was determined last year. So now governments have to come to COP27 with not only increased ambition, but also with actual policy that has been agreed upon by their governments. So they're going to start implementing policies that'll start ratcheting down CO2. Great question. Just going to look in the chat. Great. And for those of you who want the slides, again, they're in the chat. Thanks for reposting them. Any other questions before I continue? This is why you are all so important. Most of us live in democracies, And this won't happen unless we're asking for it. So even and most people don't, I know in my own country, most Canadians can't name one climate policy. And here I've just told you 20 of them. Okay. So, and most people don't know that the government actually has to spend literally years creating these policies and getting buy-in from all the other parties, and then from this, and then the entire government has to do that, while at the same time trying to get reelected, while at the same time, convincing the people this is what we need to do. So they need our help to do this. So thank you everyone for being here and beginning to understand, or already understanding, but now building upon that, what needs to be done and what has been done. So thank you. So another thing the governments have been getting for 30 years are the Ipcc reports, over 30 years. The first one was in 1990. And the sixth report was released starting in August of 2021 on the physical science basis, and then impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability in February 2022, and mitigation of climate change in March of 2022. These documents are sent to all governments. All of these documents have well over 200 scientists from 70 or 80 countries around the world directly writing them. And then another whole other level of input from another 400 or 500, sometimes 700 people, scientists from all over the world, commenting on them, with well over 60,000 comments. And then all countries have to sign off on these documents. So this is actually government documents designed by government scientists or people appointed by their governments to be there. And then the governments have to sign off on it. So it's crowdsourced with the best science there is from the best scientists. And lastly, these scientists are volunteers. And if they lie, they lose their jobs. And so, and they're cross-checked like crazy. So this is official government documents with the greatest integrity embedded into it. And we focus a lot on money at Citizens Climate International because this transformation will be financed by money. You can't do it any other way. So, so the financial flows are still too slow, but there's enough capital to do this. And I've already told you that the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, it can pretty much close this gap. So we just need rules from our governments to start the money to flow in a good direction, and always acknowledging that these gaps are the widest for developing countries. And we definitely support, all sorts of accommodations and assistance for those countries in the global south, 100%. And all of this must be embedded in human rights and gender justice. But just know that this is totally doable. So again, however, it relies on clear signaling from governments and the international community, including a stronger alignment of public sector finance and policy. So what are those policies? Well, just so you know, the G7 and the G20 last year committed to having ambitious climate ambitions at their G7 in Germany and the G20 in Bali, Indonesia. And so we started working behind the scenes, monitoring that or being directly involved. And the G7 it's always ongoing, but the big meeting happened in June. And the Youth 7, the Think Tank 7, the Civil Society 7, the Women's 7, the Science 7, all of them demanded either carbon pricing, except for the C7, and they just demanded financial flows be redirected. So all of them had big demands for carbon pricing. And even the C20 in Indonesia is asking, this is the civil society groups advising the G20 are demanding carbon pricing. So this is the first time ever you've seen such, like it used to just be remove fossil fuel subsidies, which is great. But if you actually do the math, and it's morally wrong to have fossil fuel subsidies, but if you do the proper calculations, more is needed. A lot more is needed. So anyway, so that was exciting to see all this happen. And we were involved in both the C7, which is the Civil Society 7, and the Women's 7. And I'm going to Germany next month to keep pushing this financial flows thing amongst women and keep saying, we've got to run out ahead of this, because if we don't get it, we'll probably get trickle-down economics, which doesn't work. We've got to make sure the money flows in the right direction. So that's what happened at the G7 and the G20. At COP26 was the most riveting speech I've ever heard by President Mia Mottley of Barbados. And she made a demand for quantitative easing, which is something the COPs actually can't address, because that's that's the Bank of Canada does all that thing, or the central banks of your countries do that. And she reminded everyone that the central banks of the wealthiest countries engaged in $25 trillion of quantitative easing in the last 13 years. 25 trillion. Of that, 9 trillion at that point was in the past 18 months to fight the pandemic. How do we use that 25 trillion to purchase bonds to finance the energy transitions, or transition of how we eat or how we move ourselves in transport? We would now today be reaching that 1.5 C limit that is so vital to all of us. And, this is hurricane season. And again, Puerto Rico, almost to the day of 5 years ago, Hurricane Maria got hit by Hurricane Fiona. I mean, the Caribbean is just being hammered, and they will continue to be hammered. They're at risk. So good for her saying that, reminding us there's money. Christina Figueris, who used to be the secretariat for the UNFCCC, is now the founder of Global Optimists. She's a stubborn optimist, and I think we too are at Citizens Climate International. Is also a member of the B team. And I know we talk a lot about fossil fuel subsidies, but in general, when you add up all the subsidies that are destroying the planet, it's calculated at $1.8 trillion a year. That's more than enough to finance the transition. Like I said, there is money. There's money from quantitative easing. There's money from redirecting fossil fuel subsidies and other subsidies. So here's a great number, and the slides are in the chat if you want these numbers. So in June for the G7 summit, we wrote a very wonky letter asking, it was very long. It wasn't one of these emotionally like, you got to do this because it's emergent. It was like, no, we want you to redirect financial flows away from fossil fuels and towards a resilient and equitable future. We want to finance a successful adaptation and resilience. And we also endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a whole other thing I won't get into unless you have questions. But we got almost 1,200 people from 80 countries to send letters to the G7 asking them to steer us to safety in this very wonky letter. So thank you, everyone who sent those letters and got people to send letters, because it was noticed by the G7 presidency, I was told. So thank you. And that being said, we're going to do the same for the G20. We're still working on an open letter, and they will be meeting in Bali at the same time we're at COP27. So probably at the end of October, early November, we'll be launching this letter. And please sign it and share it. And when I mean share it, I mean literally go on your phone and say, please sign this, cut and paste it into your text messaging. Because the direct asks really make a difference. And yeah, the G20 will be in Bali during COP27. So that's it. And I'm going to stop for a moment and we'll do a quick carbon pricing 101 and how we work. But I want to leave this moment now to just, I've set the stage for, what happened and what we're about to do. Any questions? I hope you're as excited as I am, because I see big changes coming and we get to help make that happen. Most people don't talk to their politicians about these things. You can't imagine how powerful you are when you do. And so appreciated, no matter where you are in the world, with an exception of a few countries, I'll admit. So carbon pricing, we do focus on carbon pricing. And a couple things you might want to note that Canada is working with the EU on border carbon adjustment mechanisms to prevent leakage in a World Trade Organization that is compatible and to accelerate global climate action. And to our friends in the global south, we push very hard for those to be to recognize common but differentiated responsibilities. Okay, so we in the global north are responsible for most of these emissions. We have different rules, much more stringent rules. Totally acknowledge that. So anyways, but that's good news because this means global carbon pricing is coming, and this is one of the levers that will make it happen. So that was Canada and the EU, but it also happened between Canada and Chile as well. They're also working on, synergizing carbon pricing in the within Chile and in this hemisphere as well. There are many ways to price carbon pollution. To date, only 22% of emissions are covered by direct carbon pricing. So that means we are paying for the damage. We are paying through our insurance premiums. We are paying by increased food costs, and we are paying for when infrastructure or something is destroyed and our government has to replace it. And money has to be constantly redirected towards climate damage by our governments. So we are paying. This is an indirect way to price carbon pollution, and it's also called intrinsic. And most people don't really think of it as carbon pricing regulation, but it is. When governments or businesses have to change how they work because of regulation, this costs money to the company, and this costs money to the government because they have to monitor it. So it's an indirect form of carbon pricing. So these are things that are pushing the economy away from fossil fuels, and it's and pricing carbon pollution. Now, the three most direct ways to price carbon pollution are cap and trade. So you put a cap on emissions, allow companies to trade under that, and they can offset. I'll leave it at that. It's not my area of expertise. If you have questions, I'll expand on it. And then there's two more ways. One is a carbon tax. Government prices carbon pollution and then takes that money and uses it for programming. Who wants to pay more taxes? Put up your hand. Come on, put up your hand. Okay, nobody. Most of us, I know in my own country, many countries around the world, most people are already taxed to the max. And they're one or two paychecks away from a financial disaster. And we saw that with COVID. We saw like the bottom 50% of many countries in the world, their earners were totally suffering unless the government's got them money or food or whatever. So a carbon tax, most people don't want to pay more taxes. Also, it's distortionary as well because it stops circulating money in the economy. Nobody knows where it's going. It actually can be regressive and slow down things if it's not designed properly. A properly designed carbon tax it's fine. A properly designed cap and trade program is fine. Another way to do this, it's all we want is that market signal for carbon pricing. Is just to put a price on carbon pollution and give the money back to the people. Because that price on carbon pollution will signal to investors and companies and households on a timeline when fossil fuels will become too expensive and we can plan accordingly. And by giving the money back to the people, you can get that price up high enough so it can do the work it's supposed to do. So the true cost of fossil fuel pollution is reflected. And you're probably asking, where does it happen? I'll tell you in a moment. So just to remind you, you increase the price of carbon pollution from industry at the source. You give the money back to the people. And then to level the playing field, you eventually, as that price creeps up past $70, $80, $90 a ton, include socially just border carbon adjust mechanisms so that, countries that that are like in the global south have time to catch up, but at least the global north starts getting on board for carbon pricing. And Canada has this policy. We have everything but border carbon adjustment mechanisms. It's called the Federal Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. And it now applies in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario. And in 2023, it will also apply to Nova Scotia. It has two components. It has this part here where there's a fuel on consumption and heating fuel, and the money, consumers don't pay that fuel charge. It's actually paid directly to the government, but it's embedded in the cost of everything, and then we get the money back. And then our emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries like cement, car manufacturing, mining, big companies, chemicals, et cetera, they can be registered as an OPPS facility, which means output-based carbon pricing facility, which is cap and trade, but without a cap, and kind of like that. And they pay a much reduced price, but it still sends a market signal and it decreases emissions. So this portion here in Canada, 90% of the fees collected are returned to households. The other 10 goes to what's called the MUSH industry, so municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals. And 80% of households come out ahead. Rural and remote households get a bonus, and Canadian farms have a separate fee and rebate system for farm fuels. And without it, our emissions would actually rise. This is Canada's studies. Fossil fuel air pollution was responsible for 18% of all global deaths. So we've got to get rid of fossil fuels, and we know the most powerful way to do that is through carbon pricing. And the type of carbon pricing we advocate for will save lives. It will put money in your pocket. This climate income person to spend every month with no restrictions. And we know from many countries around the world that most low and middle income countries come out ahead. People come out ahead. Here is some data from the Parliamentary Budget Office in Canada showing just that. I won't go into details, but you can flip back through the slides to look at it. But it's not just us that says this. You can actually look at data and you can see that the richest 5% are responsible for well over 35% of greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. And if you combine the richest 10%, it's almost 50% of emissions come from the top 10% of earners. And you can see that the bottom 50% of earners consume much less compared to them. And that's why most people come out ahead. If you look at this graph here, you can see in all the countries for which there is data, the top 10% of earners consume way more fossil fuels than average, and the bottom 50% and bottom 40% consume less. So that's why with a carbon fee and dividend system or a climate income system, most people come out ahead. And then thankfully, some scientists published an article in Nature, and they actually found that implementing a carbon pricing policy like Canada has, where you put a price on pollution, give the money back to the people, that price on pollution sends that market signal for everybody, including businesses, to start redirecting what they're doing towards decreasing fossil fuels, and giving the money back not only reduces GHGs, but income inequality as well. So great. We get 2 for 1 with this policy. So exciting. And it's honestly, you do the modeling. It's the single most powerful tool we have to get to net zero by 2050. And on October 14th, Friday, October 14th, Canada is hosting On Roads and I'll announce that again. And our parliamentarians are going to ask them to enter their favorite climate policies into the On-Roads policy simulator. And perhaps they might ask, what happens when you remove fossil fuel subsidies? What happens when you subsidize clean energy to the max? What happens when you maximize tree growth on the planet? And what happens when you price carbon? And we've set it up at On-Roads to look at the global primary sources of energy, air pollution, and global temperatures. And this is what the baseline looks like. Here's the fossil fuels, here's the air pollution, and here's the global temperatures. And very quickly, if you remove all fossil fuel subsidies, barely anything happens. Now, it's morally wrong to subsidize our, our demise, and that money could be better spent. But just so you know that, even if we maximize clean energy subsidies and everything, and did it in an appropriate way, because rich people consume more energy than poor people, and if we could direct those in a proper way, it will only shave off 0.4 degrees. And I agree that we need to be doing some really good subsidizing and thoughtful subsidizing of clean energy. There's a lot there for that, but no, even if we maximized it, it only shaves off 4 degrees. And but it does improve air quality and does shift fossil fuel use away from fossil fuels. Maximizing tree growth. If we could maximize every single tree and stop chopping down forests and plant as much as possible, it only lowers global temperatures by 0.2 degrees. So, and it does, and because all of this would happen far away from cities for the most part, it does barely anything to air quality. And because it doesn't provide any sort of market signal to the fossil fuel industry to stop, it does nothing for fossil fuels. But if we maximize carbon pricing, we shave off a whole degree temperature. Nothing comes close. And if you play with the On-Roads policy simulator, you will find that it's almost impossible to get to a 1.5C planet without carbon pricing, but you can't get to carbon pricing. It can't get to a 1.5C planet with carbon pricing alone. So that's why we support so many other things, and we use evidence. And honestly, this is the policy is the government sets the direction, and this provides businesses with the direction they need to in order to provide abundant, affordable, and reliable clean energy. And this will drive us faster to a net zero pollution. And lastly, all these policy simulators cannot take into consideration how humans will respond, because most of us really want to get off fossil fuels. So once we get these right market signals, it's actually felt that this will actually happen faster than expected, because most models are conservative. That means they're not generous. So any questions about carbon pricing? And I will do a quick intro to CCL, and I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. We've got 8 minutes, so it's a really quick intro to CCL, and then we can talk about getting connected to your chapters. So any questions?
Hi, everyone. I have a question.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Nice to meet you.
All right. Nice to meet you. I'm Federico from Italy. I would like to know if there could be another solution for what is gained in taxing carbon, not just giving it back to people, because then people, at the moment at least, would spend it again in actions that produce CO2. What about giving a part of it at least to carbon compensating projects? They exist in lots of places all around the world, probably even in Canada, reforestation and such.
That's an idea that I took 2 years to understand why. Maybe that's not why. I always thought, why can't we just give some of the money back? Federico, I lobbied for this for a couple of years before I could really appreciate why it's so important to give the money back. There are probably at least 2 really good reasons, and if anybody else wants to help me, that's great. One, we need to get that price up really high. like literally to $150, $200 a ton, and most people cannot afford that. So giving the money back to the people builds the political will for that price to go high. The second reason is more economics. When the government picks favorites and starts putting money into various projects, this makes it very difficult for investors to know where to invest because some companies get favored over others. So it complicates the market signal. It makes the carbon pricing signal weaker. So, yeah. And lastly, if money is needed, so this is not answering that, but if money is needed, like for special projects, like for rural and remote regions or special programs for people who are disadvantaged, monies can be taken or can be found through tax reform. Our countries have many ways of getting money. And if you look at your tax, like how your taxes work out in your country, almost all of us can find ways to get money redirected in the right way. So you could take money from ending fossil fuel subsidies or ending nature destroying subsidies, and you could take that money and redirect it towards communities that need and towards projects that are really worthy. So I hope that was helpful, Federico. And where in Italy are you from? My grandparents were born there.
Oh, really? I'm from Verona.
Verona. Okay, my grandparents were from Cosenza. Yeah, I know.
Oh, nice. That's a song.
Yeah, Cosenza, Pianiclati, a tiny little village in the mountains.
Oh, yeah. It's probably a beautiful town, isn't it?
I've never been, but I might go someday.
Okay. You have to go.
I have to go. And we don't have an active chapter in Italy. So if you are interested in learning more, please recontact me and I will put my email in the chat. Yes, Gladys.
Thank you.
I was just going to say that perhaps also giving the money back to the people has been very helpful for the people of lower income. And so if we put a tax on the oil and gas carbon, it slowly grows over the years, but the oil and gas, they transfer that to gas that you put in your car, et cetera, and it adds to that price. And so they've giving it back to the people helps the lower income people is more has a higher impact on them, and it also builds political will. The people they see the check in their hand, they have the physical check in their hand, and they realize this is where this money is coming from, and it becomes sort of a snowball effect.
Yeah, super important for political will. And we just got our first physical checks this July. It was so exciting in Canada. It was so exciting. We were so happy. Okay. Oh, thanks, Moj. That's awesome. Okay, so we're getting more videos. Okay, any more questions? That was a great question, Federico. And that's something I struggled with for years.
Thank you. Kathy. Thank you for the reply. I understood that it's basically a thing of moving the will of people and making them understand. And that's like a first move before moving forward to further actions.
You're getting it. This is almost like I like these sessions. They're almost like therapy for carbon pricing activists, because you have to actually say it out loud over and over again before you can actually, feel like comfortable saying it to many people. So it's really appreciative that both you and Gladys jumped in and said it your way, because that's really important.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I am running out of time and I'm afraid I have an appointment at 9. So I'm going to just whip through this. We do have a way of working at Citizens Climate Lobby we have our values. And when you're trained to work with us, we go into great detail about these values, and these values guide us. And anytime I'm confused, I go back to the values and then I move forward. This is so helpful. We have exercises for that. We have a way of working. We bucket our work. This is why I joined Citizens Climate Lobby. They were so organized. You literally only need to take 10 hours a month at the most, except for maybe the month where you're really lobbying, where it's a little bit more. We give you action. Well, if you're in a country that does this properly, and we help you do this. If you're from a country that's still developing, we bucket it into media, grassroots outreach, group development, lobbying, and grass tops engagement. And by pulling on all of these levers, you slowly build that political will, and you do it in a very organized manner. And it's not like everything's coming at you all at once. You focus in on one thing, get her done. Focus in on another thing, get her done. It's really nice. It really and it's very satisfying to get stuff done. So it's great. And then, we strongly advise having monthly meetings, and our most successful groups do that. And you learn, celebrate, practice, and act. And I'm going to end with Mahatma Gandhi, because he is probably the foundation of what we do. Here on the right is General Schmutt. He was the general whom which Mahatma Gandhi was they were adversaries in South Africa when they met, when Gandhi was getting arrested in South Africa over 100 years ago. General Schmutt said to him, when he got arrested, "What do you intend to happen?" And Gandhi, who was fighting for rights for the brown people of South Africa, said, "I intend to prevail." And General Schmutt said, "How?" And Gandhi said, "With your help." So he knew that, we needed to work together. And, ultimately, I think most of us know the story of Gandhi, but when he died, General Schmutt wrote, "I've worn these sandals for many a summer, even though I may feel that I am not worthy to stand in the shoes of so great a man. It was my fate to be the antagonist of a man for whom even then I had the highest respect." So I leave you with that. Gandhi is